In a perfect world, Russia should be a very wealthy country. They control the largest landmass on the face of the earth, equivalent to 11% of all the land on the entire planet. And that landmass itself is incredibly rich, with some of the world's biggest deposits of oil, natural gas, and rare earth minerals. Not to mention more basic things like an almost unlimited supply of lumber and large areas fit for agriculture, with the potential to feed up to 2 billion people. Not all of Russia's land is useful, of course. Large portions are also occupied by basically worthless snow, ice, or tundra. But because it's just so large, Russia still has more than enough resources at its disposal to be a serious player in the world economy, if it was well managed. But for some reason, Russia has consistently failed to live up to its potential. And despite the fact that Russia's landmass is 56 times larger than that of Italy, and full of valuable natural materials to boot, with 2.5 times as many people as Italy has, their economy is still embarrassingly 10% smaller than Italy's is, with a national minimum wage of just $2,500 per year. In spite of its potential for wealth, for most of its history, poverty and Russia have gone hand in hand in the minds of most people. And now, following in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine and the consequences that have followed it, Russia is in very serious danger of getting kicked back all the way to square one. So how did Russia come to this? And where does Russia's economic potential sit today? Can Russia really afford to continue to fund its full-scale war against Ukraine, or the future invasions that it likely has planned? And what does all this mean for Russia's long-term national economic potential? As we dive into all of that, quickly, a word about what made this video possible. Our topic today is obviously controversial, with opinions split based on who you ask. That's why to research videos like this, I like to use Ground News, an app and website which helps me surface the views from all sides of the issues and events I discuss. Let me show you how it works. Take a look at this story on the EU approving a new package of sanctions against Russia, something that is very relevant when analyzing the current and future state of the Russian economy. On Ground News, I can see that this story has been covered by more than 190 sources. What's interesting is that 29% of the coverage leans left, 35% leans center, and 36% leans right. Which means if you're only reading sources from one side of the spectrum or the other, you may miss the true significance of this story altogether. If I scroll down, I can see every article about this topic and compare headlines. And beside every headline, there is a tag showing me the political bias, reliability, and ownership of the source. For example, this headline from the Hindustan Times phrases things in a specific way, saying the UK is announcing sanctions ahead of the anniversary of the war, while many other sources are more specific, highlighting that the sanctions are a result of Alexei Navalny's death. Those are, of course, two very different stories, and the way things are framed makes a difference on how you perceive current events. So I've been using Ground News because I think this type of analysis is really important to ensure you aren't being overly influenced by one narrative or the other. You can try it yourself by going to ground.news/Icarus to check it out. And since Ground News is the sponsor of this video, you can subscribe through my link for as little as $5 per month, or get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription this month only, which is what I currently use, giving you full access to both their website and their mobile app. Now, back to the video. Russia's current economic position does not exist in a vacuum. Their current plight is just a recent iteration in a sad saga of wasted potential and squandered resources that has plagued basically all of Russian history. And as has always been the case for Russia, it's not a result of poor geographical positioning, but instead a result of poor governance and dictatorship that has consistently mismanaged the nation's absolute potential goldmine. Just take a quick look at Russia's extremely turbulent story to see how bad things really are, never learning from the mistakes of their past, and therefore being doomed to repeat them, all the way up to the modern day. During the time of the Russian Empire, the basic cause for Russian poverty was a late start to industrialization, but it went deeper than that. While Russia controlled a huge landmass, they had few systems in place beyond manual human labor to leverage that landmass, and they didn't care. There were some fantastically rich people in Russia at this time, as there still are today, namely the emperors and those around them who helped to prop up the imperial system. But almost everyone else was basically destitute, especially those outside of Moscow. Russia has always had an economy based on a small number of major trade goods, and the Russian Empire was no different. The economy at that time produced two major things: furs and vodka, both of which were also used as weapons to control and subdue the Russian people. As for the furs, the empire demanded them as tributes from the Siberian tribes, basically protection money against imaginary enemies that had actually themselves been sent by the Russian state to scare the tribes. As for vodka, it made up a third of the imperial budget, just from sales to Russia's own people. It was introduced into the Russian economy as one of the only mass-produced goods in the entire country, with the emperor himself controlling the means of production and the profits. While other empires were industrializing to try to lower the price of things like food and clothing, Russia was only really industrializing to lower the price of vodka, so that it could be sold at a low enough price to keep the people generally drunk enough and passive enough to not have the ability or the desire to resist the empire. Because the Tsars got everything they wanted from this system, they had no incentives to change anything. The Tsars, as the only holders of enough capital to start the process of industrialization, were far too busy exploiting people's livelihoods to care enough to invest in improving them. And this is a trend you will see more or less carried on all the way to modern Russian history. The ruling style of the Tsars, of course, led to a general sense of despair, especially as Russians witnessed the prosperity of Europe rising all around them and saw what was possible. Eventually, it helped birth the Russian Revolution. After overthrowing the Tsar, the Russian people then made an effort to establish a system of communism meant to replace the greedy elite ruling class and bring prosperity to the people. But during the Soviet Union, under communism, things didn't get much better. A new ruling class soon emerged to replace the power vacuum left by the Tsars. They may not have held their wealth on paper as their own private property, but they certainly used the wealth of the state as their own personal honeypot, living in abundance while others lived in squalor. And at least in terms of verifiable deaths, the Soviet rulers were far worse than the Tsars were. Despite pie-in-the-sky visions of a coming communist utopia, breadlines and starvation were still commonplace. And during this time, most of the Soviet Union's 200 million plus people didn't accomplish more than a very basic living, if they managed to accomplish a living at all. This was despite the fact that Russia's own agricultural land, not even counting the rest of the agricultural land in the Soviet Empire, was sufficient to feed many more times than the size of the entire Soviet population. Also, oil was growing as a new highly demanded resource, and Russia had a seemingly unlimited supply to sell and trade with, or use for their own purposes. So either by growing it for themselves or trading for it, the Soviet Union should have had more than enough food, and many other things. But abundance never really characterized the lives of the Soviets. Still, somehow, when they needed to produce enough equipment to overpower Hitler's invasion, they were able to industrialize all that they needed, seemingly overnight, including over 87,000 Soviet tanks, proving that the economy was capable of great things. Once again, Russia had found itself in a state of selective production, always producing enough to maintain the status of the nation, and therefore the status of the national elite, but never producing enough to satisfy the people. The Soviet economy technically grew, but its only real significant growth was in military production, leading them to earn the description of Upper Volta, but with rockets, with Upper Volta referring to a poor country in West Africa that has since been renamed Burkina Faso. The equivalent descriptor used for Russia today is now that they are a gas station, but with nukes, showing that things still haven't changed all that much. Far from removing the desperation created by the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union simply rebirthed it in a new form, still mismanaging Russia's vast resources, just this time in a new, hip, modern way that replaced furs with tanks and vodka with artillery shells, and then added vodka back into. Russia still had its basic problems: authoritarian leadership receiving the vast majority of the benefits of the Russian economy, and never enough infrastructure or technology to truly leverage Russia's geographical gifts for the good of the people. Such, it seemed, was destined to forever become the Russian legacy, because as the Soviet Union fell, things didn't get any better, but somehow managed to get even worse. Under Soviet communism, the state owned the country's major money-making enterprises. When communism went away, Russia needed a way to distribute the ownership of those enterprises into the hands of new owners. The idea that was put forth was the same basic principle that had been put forth at the start of the Russian Revolution: give the enterprises to the people. Theoretically, each Russian citizen was given vouchers that could be exchanged for shares of the formerly state-owned enterprises, which gave them an ownership interest in the new companies that were being created. The basic concept was the same as the stock market. You own a piece of the company, and therefore a piece of the company's future profits and growth. This actually could have been a good deal for the former Soviet people. But even in the highly information-rich societies of today, with the internet at their fingertips, few people truly understand even the basics of how a stock market works. Even more so in Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union, among people who had lived through a full generation of not being allowed to own significant capital-producing assets, let alone having received a financial education on how to use them properly. So what happened next probably should have been anticipated. Maybe it even was. The voucher system opened up unique opportunities for the few Russians who actually understood how capital ownership and economics worked: mobsters who had been illegally trading in the black markets for years. These men took to the streets in earnest, purchasing vouchers from unsuspecting citizens for pennies on the dollar, or sometimes for pennies on the $100, whatever the lowest price was that they could get. By doing so, they were able to amass controlling interests in Russia's major industries, like oil, gas, alcohol, and media. And once they had a controlling interest, they were able to gradually edge out or buy out the other owners who had kept their vouchers through various other tactics. And in this way, the Russian people literally sold their birthrights to the mob for what sometimes amounted to a single bottle of vodka or a single bowl of stew. Soon, a new Russian elite class had formed, the infamous Russian oligarch, and the most unworthy type of people, those who had been part of organized crime groups for decades, came to be those who now had power over the wealth of the Russian nation. The Tsars had been reborn, and in this way, the newly birthed Russian Federation fell into the same trap of all the other major governmental changes in Russia, where nothing really changed except for the faces of the people holding the power. The underlying structures that had led to national poverty were still in place. It's a long story, but the short version is, to legitimize their authority, the newly minted oligarchs used their power and influence to get the political leaders elected who would support them. People thought they were choosing a new leader for their federation, but really, it was the oligarchs who had chosen him for them. Thus, Vladimir Putin rose into power, largely due to the oligarchs' control over the Russian media, which was used to humiliate Putin's opponents and make Putin look like a god come to earth, a trend that still continues in Russian media today. Once in power, Putin orchestrated things in the oligarchs' favor, receiving major kickbacks in return, such as a billion-dollar mega-palace on the Black Sea, and probably many other things. This palace was exposed by Alexei Navalny, who recently mysteriously died in a Russian prison after being arrested and convicted for having the audacity to run for office against Putin, and to actually be popular amongst the people. So where does that leave the Russian economy today? Still today, despite its massive size and potential, Russia is largely shoehorned into just a few sectors of production, like oil, gas, mining, and agriculture, those that benefit the oligarchs in the industries they own the most. These are old industries that all tend to have the same characteristics: They are based on taking raw materials from the ground and sending them to other, more advanced countries for production. These types of industries are ideal for oligarchs to control because they are comparatively simple to run in comparison to other large industries like software and manufacturing, which require consistent diligence to maintain a competitive product and a competitive edge. In contrast, maintaining a competitive edge in Russia's chosen industries is easy and merely requires the use of power. To lower costs, you don't need to innovate. All that needs to be done is to lower the wages of the workers. To keep prices high, you don't have to improve your product. All you have to do is stop potential competitors from entering the market. Like, for example, invading your next-door neighbor when they discover new and massive natural gas deposits that are closer to your end consumers than you are. What else would you expect from a country whose recent origins come from literally being run like the mob? This is probably why Russia has failed to innovate and diversify beyond a natural resource-driven economy, while other large nations with huge deposits of natural resources, like the United States, have used the profits from those natural resources to birth many new industries rather than becoming siloed. It's like at the days of the Russian Empire, when Russia lagged behind its European competitors in the Industrial Revolution, because its Tsars who controlled all the capital had no personal incentive to innovate, to raise the standard of living for everyone else. That's why, still today, Russia is largely split into two parts: the extremely wealthy Russian elite and everyone else. The difference is that today, due to an overall global technological advance, Russian people at least no longer face mass starvation. And the growing interconnectedness of the world as a whole has also helped produce a small Russian middle class, accounting for less than 15% of Russia's total population, according to official data published in the Moscow Times before the invasion of Ukraine. These are the people in Russia able to afford a mortgage and a car lease with some cash left over each month. Almost everyone else still lives in poverty. The Russian government, of course, tries to spin things a bit differently. Vladimir Putin, for example, tried to redefine this small 15% figure in 2020, saying that actually 70% of the country was middle class. But Putin defined being middle class rather conveniently, as those making more than 1.5 times the official poverty line, only about 200 euros per month. Considering that Tucker Carlson just recently famously boasted that he could buy a week's worth of groceries in Russia for just a little over $100. I'll let you decide whose figure is a more accurate depiction of a true middle class. Perhaps Russia's economic situation is best depicted by the fact that, even today, over 1 in 5 Russians still do not have indoor toilets. Very inconvenient when you consider that the average winter temperature in Siberia is -25 degrees Celsius, or -13 degrees Fahrenheit. And still today, there are very few and badly maintained roads linking most of Russia together, making many of their people completely isolated and disconnected from the broader world. Of course, this is true of many other countries as well, but then those countries aren't portraying themselves as an elite nation or a global power. This brings us to the final question to consider for this video. Given the current state and structure of Russia's economy, how long can they reasonably continue to fund their invasion of Ukraine? We'll keep the comments in this one brief. Because of the way the oligarchs have designed Russia's economy, with it being so focused on just a few sectors of production, it's especially vulnerable to economic attacks. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, Russian oil and gas came under massive sanctions, which heavily reduced the country's revenues. But Russia has since recovered some of those revenues, basically by using a shadow fleet of ships to continue to trade oil. These are ships that are too old and dangerous to run and operate, and almost impossible to insure. This, in turn, creates a hugely heightened risk of a catastrophic oil spill, with no insurers prepared to help with the recovery. But it has managed to keep some money flowing in for Russia. But then again, Russia's oil industry has also recently come under not just economic attack, but also physical attack, with Ukraine beginning to strike Russian refineries and other key bottlenecks that could hamper their ability to trade their black gold. In January 2024, these efforts reduced Russian gasoline exports by a massive 37%. Probably, Russia will recover from that as well, albeit badly wounded, but it is reducing their ability to fight and to produce, and causing them to fall even further behind in the long term. Russia has been able to conceal some of the effects of the war from the people in the short term by implementing complicated economic maneuvers. So the Russian people might not fully realize the true cost until later, when the bill for the war ultimately comes due on their children and their children's children. But they will realize it. Putin just hopes that happens after him and his oligarchs are long gone. The simple answer to the basic question of, can Russia still afford to fight, is no. Of course not. Many Russians don't even have toilets or roads. They could never even afford to fight in the first place. But phrased differently, if the real question is, can Russia still find money they can use to fight? The answer is, unfortunately, probably. Because those aren't the same things. While the Russian people cannot afford to fight, the same cannot be said of Putin and his oligarchs, who simply pass on the costs to others while feeling no pain themselves, so that they can then hoard the benefits. They can perhaps afford to fight on for a good long time, plundering different sectors of the Russian economy to keep duct taping the war machine and keep the wheels turning. So the question is not, how long can Russia continue to afford to fight? The question is, how long will the Russian people tolerate the fact that their futures are being sacrificed for their political elite? The Tsars may be long gone, but the Russian Empire lives on. Be sure to watch one of these videos for the rest of the story.